The 9,926th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Threats to International Peace and Security. The agenda is adopted. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of the Russian Federation.
President, yesterday we met in this chamber solely for the European states to artificially maintain the Ukrainian issues front and center of our attention. Yet today we don't see those delegations which always come to the meetings called by Western states on Ukraine. They're not here in the chamber, but that's what we expected anyway. Today, what we suggest is that we focus not on empty rhetoric and accusations, but rather on a constructive discussion of real progress as regards the peaceful settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, including a focus on objective obstacles which continue to stand in the way of lasting peace. The logic behind what's happening with the Ukrainian settlement process is simple. Sensible forces in Ukraine, Russia, the new US administration, and the countries of the Global South first are taking serious steps to ensure that military hostilities in Ukraine end and never resume. But a simple ceasefire is not enough to achieve this. We already once stood at this very crossroads in the context of the Minsk agreements, which were systematically violated by the West in Ukraine. To achieve sustainable and lasting settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, we need to address its root causes. This is why Russia proposed resuming direct Russo-Ukrainian talks in Istanbul, which were suspended by Kiev in April of 2022 at the behest of Boris Johnson and other Western leaders. What we're proposing is a second round of talks in Istanbul this coming Monday on the 2nd of June, where we can exchange memoranda about both parties' approaches to the negotiations process. Yet there's a whole host of forces who aren't interested in this scenario, and this for various reasons. The overstayer Ukrainian president doesn't want to stop military hostilities because he fears losing his grip on power. If this happens, he'll have to hold elections and answer before his electorate for what he turned Ukraine into over the last 6 years, as well as answer for the hundreds of billions of state funds which he has stolen. And he'll have to answer to the West, first and foremost to the Americans, for the aid he received. Another force that's not interested in an end to hostilities is the party of war, or warmongers, in Europe. They have been implementing, since 2014 at least, an anti-Russian project in Ukraine, so as to ensure that military hostilities can end, so as to ensure that hostilities do not end without Russia's defeat, or without Russia at least being seriously bled dry. Because Ukraine is on the brink of full defeat, having lost millions of its citizens, European sponsors of the so-called private military company Ukraine are calling on Zelensky and his posse. In fact, they're ordering Zelensky and his posse to continue fighting to the last Ukrainian, which is compelling the Kiev regime to seize the last remaining Ukrainian men in the streets and to send them to the senseless meat grinder. London, Brussels, Paris, and Berlin, without a doubt, were somewhat discouraged by the fact that Ukraine's main shareholder, so to speak, the US, the fact that the US left this senseless and disastrous game after a new, realistic administration came to power in Washington. However, these forces aren't losing hope. They want to bring Americans back into their ranks. And in order to achieve this, they're not above using any provocations, any lies about Russia and what we're doing, so as to force the American president to reconsider. They're grappling for his attention. That's why they're making all these statements about the Ukrainian conflict. I'm referring to Western politicians who are hoping to use blatant manipulations and obfuscation to prevent the American president from fixing the relationship with Russia. We know that before Trump came to power, that Trump is in fact getting constant information about Russian strikes on military-industrial complex sites in Ukraine, despite the fact that there are targeted strikes on civilian objects. At the same time, they are hushing up the fact that these strikes are being made on military objects and enterprises linked to the military-industrial complex in Ukraine, and that we are launching these strikes in response to the unprecedented escalation of strikes on civilians and civilian cities in Russia by the Kiev regime. We gave statistics about this yesterday. In order to thwart efforts to establish peace, European states have, over the last few months, taken a whole host of steps so as to whip up tensions and escalate the situation. Thus, the new German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz, recently said that restrictions will be lifted on long-range missiles being sent to Ukraine by the UK, France, Germany, and the US. He even specified that this happened a few months ago already. Experts directly linked his words with supplies of Taurus missiles to Kiev, something the Kiev regime has been begging for since we began the special military operation. Afterwards, the German leader did try to backtrack and started to say that Germany was in fact going to help Ukraine to independently produce long-range missiles. Without a doubt, these clumsy maneuvering didn't fool anybody. Furthermore, the assembly of Tauruses, as well as uncrewed British vessels, don't make them Ukrainian. Germany is going to be drawn further into a war with Russia through these actions, which will give us the right to consider all options so as to properly respond to this unfriendly step. If there's any common sense left in Berlin, if there are still people there who haven't forgotten history, they cannot but understand what these new aggressive actions in Germany against Russia will result in. Less than a month ago, we commemorated the 80th anniversary of the inglorious end of the previous such venture launched by Germany. In Europe, they should remember this full well. After all, they suffered a great deal from German militarism and other German ventures. On the whole, we cannot but note that Germany's actions are part of a campaign Europe has launched aimed at sabotaging the peace process, trying to provoke our country to respond in a way that they can then portray before the US administration as evidence of Moscow being not ready to partake in talks. Despite their own resources running low, EU states continue to try find ways of increasing military support to the neo-Nazi regime in Kiev. This only serves to further foment tensions on the European continent. Thus, on the 26th of May, the European Council endorsed the establishment of a fund to the tune of 150 billion euros to buy ammunition and weapons. We know that this new instrument, the so-called Security Action for Europe instrument, will also be funded so-called urgent and large-scale investments in Ukrainian military production. Moreover, European states are shamelessly leading this proxy war with Russia, hoping that they will get off scot-free. They're providing Kiev with satellite intelligence. They're preparing Ukrainian armed forces, they're training them at NATO military bases, and they're sending their military advisors to Ukrainian territory. Without a doubt, the UK is the country most involved in this. The scale of the British Special Services involvement is so large that it's very difficult to brush this under the carpet. At the end of March, British journalists published an investigation into this issue. This report stated that the British are cooperating with Ukrainian servicemen so as to prepare the operation to blow up the Crimean Bridge. It also says that as early as the middle of last year, British and US officers, or perhaps earlier, were controlling every aspect of this operation. They determined the coordinates of the targets, and they also calculated the trajectories of the missile's flight path. Colleagues, do you really think that we're not noticing any of this? That we don't have detailed information about the involvement of each and every one of your states in military activities against Russia? That there will be no consequences for these actions? And yet, you've been punishing not Russia, which is doing perfectly fine under sanctions. You are punishing yourselves. Compare the state of your countries now and 3 years ago. This shows how this senseless course is having an impact on the sponsors of the Kiev regime. Until you stop considering what's happening as simply a zero-sum game, until you do that, the situation for Europe and its satellites will only go from bad to worse. Furthermore, it is high time to understand that there is no magical weapon that can change the course of the military campaign, which is going very poorly for Kiev. Mr. Chairman, I harbor no doubts about the fact that today we will once again hear carbon copy speeches from the Western sponsors of the Zelensky regime, allegations leveled at Russia, statements about Ukraine's right to self-defense using any means, and calls for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. This being portrayed as the only evidence of readiness to achieve peace and a ceasefire for minimum 30 days. Or for at least 30 days, a ceasefire. Yet if we take away all this rhetoric, which is being used to confuse the global south, we understand what is behind these initiatives. These initiatives are underpinned by a desire to once again confuse us, to compel us to take an unilateral act of good faith, which will then be used by the Ukrainians to gather their strength and also to pump Kiev full of more weapons. This is not a path to peace. This is an attempt to pause so as to continue the confrontation. Well, don't count on it. You won't get another Minsk. In principle, we're prepared to consider the possibility of establishing a ceasefire, which would then, in future, pave the way for a lasting settlement to the root causes of the conflict. In order to achieve this, however, we need to see the other party taking steps as well. We've voiced our concerns on many occasions. During the ceasefire, we need, at the very least, for the Western states to stop supplying Kiev with weapons, as well as for Ukraine to stop its mobilization. Yet all of your statements indicate that you cannot agree to such a scenario, whereas we cannot agree to a situation which would allow the Kiev regime to lick their wounds and to stop the collapse of its eastern front. If we're seriously talking about peace, we need to discuss the parameters of peace, the conditions of peace, and after that actually discuss the ceasefire and agree to it. This is what the direct Russo-Ukrainian negotiations process in Istanbul is trying to achieve. This is the litmus test for a real, not simply in words. This is the real aspiration for peace. Especially given that the Russian Federation has already unilaterally respected a 30-day moratorium on strikes on energy infrastructure, as well as the Easter ceasefire, as well as the Victory Day ceasefire. The Kiev regime simply ignored all of these opportunities to demonstrate its readiness to pursue peace. So what are you waiting for? What do you want from us? President, we've said and want to repeat that the objective of our special military operation can be achieved through peaceful or military means. Our armed forces stand ready to continue stepping up their military activities insofar as is necessary. Look at any military reports, even those biased against Russia. They clearly show that Russian forces are successfully making headway across practically the entire front line. Our Ministry of Defense is publishing information on a daily basis about us freeing various settlements and destroying foreign equipment. Despite the fact we've always underscored that we are committed to a political and diplomatic settlement of the crisis. What's of principal importance for us is for the root causes of the conflict to be addressed once and for all. In 2014, owing to an anti-constitutional coup d'etat supported and sponsored by the US and the EU, a new regime came to power in Ukraine, and it tried to stamp out all that is Russian. Over all these years, it has violated the rights of people living in the east and the south of Ukraine and in other regions as well. We cannot and will not sit idly by and look on as millions of Russian-speaking people continue to live under a regime where it's pursuing a policy which flagrantly violates their main rights and freedoms. If the authorities in Kiev, neo-Nazi authorities, think that they can achieve an end to the military hostilities and at the same time maintain the system of repression and discrimination vis-à-vis a significant portion of its own population in Ukraine, well then they're deeply mistaken. Maintaining the status quo means knowingly ignoring norms of international law and the UN Charter. Article 1 of the Charter clearly states that we must respect human rights irrespective of their language, race, sex, or religion. Today, in Ukraine, we see the exact opposite. In practice, the Russian-speaking population is being persecuted. The canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church is seeing restrictions placed on its activities, and there are other flagrant violations of the rights of national minorities. Thus, we call on our European colleagues who have been so actively defending democratic values to demand for Kiev to abolish discriminatory laws which are directly at odds with international law. This would be an opportunity to really put your position to the test. For now, we've heard all sorts of pronouncements about human rights, but we haven't seen a single instance of real steps being taken to protect the rights of millions of people. Their rights are being systematically violated in Ukraine as we speak. The political expediency is making our Western colleagues deaf and dumb when it comes to the rights of the Russian-speaking population in Ukraine, the Russian language, canonical orthodoxy, the glorification of Hitler's accomplices, and the dissemination of neo-Nazism in Ukraine. If you really do want lasting and sustainable peace in Ukraine, the current situation cannot continue. President, the time has come for everyone to choose. We did this back in 2022. And we won't leave Russian people to their own devices. If we need, we will continue fighting for as long as necessary, if that's necessary. No threats to our borders, no anti-Russian, neo-Nazi education in neighboring countries. We won't allow for any of that to happen. Now the ball is in the court of those who are behind the anti-Russian project in Ukraine. Did they understand the mistakes they made, how senseless it is to try and vanquish and isolate Russia? If you truly are Russophobes, then, well, we probably don't have anything to discuss with you. However, if you are ready to discuss potential options for us to coexist or perhaps even to cooperate, then we can talk. We've never rejected dialogue, nor do we reject dialogue now. The choice is yours. I thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of the Russian Federation for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. تتواصل الحرب الدائرة.
Thank you, President. The war between Russia and Ukraine is continuing. The logic of confrontation and escalation is also continuing, as well as strikes and polarization. And this continues in spite of the diplomatic efforts that have recently been successful in gathering the two parties together in the city of Istanbul in Turkey for the first time in more than 3 years. Unfortunately, the losses in terms of innocent human lives, including children, women, and older persons, these numbers are still increasing. And we're also seeing an increase in the suffering of civilians and displaced persons, and people are simply having to flee their homes and flee the conflict areas. In addition, this conflict continues to spread, and it has economic impacts not just in the region but in the entire world, including in developing regions that have been affected seriously by energy and food crises that have resulted from this. Algeria has warned on several occasions about the flow of weapons from conflict areas, which exacerbates the ferocity of the war and moves us away from any potential peaceful solution. The escalation of tensions will only lead to further hostilities, which could themselves lead the entire region into a interminable conflict and crisis. Therefore, today we would like to reiterate the following points. First of all, the escalation is continuing, and the bloody armed conflict between the two parties remains a major concern for Algeria. Algeria condemns the violations of international law, including international humanitarian law. We call on the parties once again to show restraint and to curb the escalation and to respect their international commitments, prioritizing the protection of civilians. Targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure is unacceptable in any circumstances. Under international law, this is forbidden. Secondly, we would once again like to express our deep concern about the use of lethal weapons and ammunition in the conflict areas. We call on the parties to ensure that these weapons do not fall into the hands of criminal or terrorist groups or extremist groups, which often use them in attacks against innocent civilians to impose their control. 3, we reiterate our appeal to the parties to ensure that dialogue prevails and to use diplomacy, focusing all efforts on trying to find common understanding through direct negotiations, with the goal of a ceasefire in mind and to achieve lasting peace in the region on the basis of the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, while also bearing in mind their respective security concerns as appropriate. By way of conclusion, Algeria reiterates its unwavering commitment to support any diplomatic efforts that aim to put an end to this war and to find a just, lasting solution that can satisfy both parties. We call on the international community to redouble diplomatic efforts at all levels to bring about the necessary conditions to facilitate negotiations between the two parties to bring about peace and security in the region.
I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. This council met as recently as yesterday to discuss the situation in Ukraine. In that meeting, the United States called on the Russian Federation to demonstrate a sincere interest in peace and accept a ceasefire. We have little to add to that statement. The Russian Federation called today's meeting to advance the claim that European countries, by providing assistance to Ukraine, are undermining efforts to restore peace. That is not the case. Ukraine, as a sovereign country, has the right to defend itself from aggression. Ukraine's fellow UN member states have a right to provide Ukraine with the means to do so. Moreover, every member of this council understands Ukraine is not the obstacle to a ceasefire that could lead to peace. Ukraine has repeatedly affirmed it is ready to accept an immediate, unconditional, and comprehensive ceasefire. It is Russia that has rejected this call. We share the concern expressed by other members of this council that Russia could be uninterested in peace and instead bent on achieving a military victory. So today, the United States calls on those countries supporting Russia's war industrial base to work towards peace instead of fueling war. We urge China to reconsider supplying dual-use goods to Russia's war industrial base. Drones made by Chinese companies using Chinese technology are destroying Ukraine's cities and Ukrainian families. China's policies are enabling the killing and prolonging the war. Russia's reliance on weapons and troops from the DPRK and its training of DPRK troops are particularly troubling, considering the many UN Security Council resolutions they violate. And the risk, Pyongyang could use whatever rewards it receives from Russia to further threaten peace and security in its own region. The United States continues to stand for peace. It is not too late for both Russia and Ukraine to stop the fighting. We urge both sides to do so. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. The UN Charter emphasizes respect for the independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of member states. We have all pledged to uphold the principles of the Charter, but Russia has blatantly violated this commitment with its brutal, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, for which it must be held fully accountable. Multiple resolutions of the General Assembly have demanded that Russia withdraw its forces from Ukraine, confirming that Russia is the aggressor and Ukraine the victim. Ukraine has the right, under Article 51 of the UN Charter, to defend itself in the face of Russia's illegal, unjustified, and unprovoked full-scale invasion launched over 3 years ago. It also has the right to acquire weapons to defend itself. Instead of discussing Ukraine's entirely legitimate effort to acquire arms for the defense of its territorial integrity and sovereignty, the Council should focus on the credible reports, notably from the Multilateral Sanctions Monitoring Team. Such reports say that Russia has imported 4 million artillery shells and over 100 ballistic missiles from North Korea, a clear violation of the UN sanctions regime Russia itself agreed to. Or the reported 12,000 North Korean troops fighting against Ukraine in Russia's illegal war of aggression. Russia has also reportedly received huge quantities of drones from Iran, as well as related components and know-how, which are used to attack civilians across Ukraine, in violation of international humanitarian law. Mr. President, these are the international arms transfers that must stop. Night after night, we see waves of drones and missiles raining down on Ukraine's cities. Thousands of Ukrainian civilians, including hundreds of children, have been indiscriminately killed in the war and many more injured. Russia continues to escalate its attacks, twice in recent days breaking its own grisly record for the number of drones launched on Ukraine's cities in a single day. And just 2 days ago, the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine concluded that Russian armed forces had committed crimes against humanity of murder through a month-long pattern of drone attacks against civilians in areas of the Kherson province. Mr. President, Denmark underlines that Ukraine has accepted an immediate, comprehensive, and unconditional 30-day ceasefire. Russia, in contrast, has not. Russia could end the war today if it would only stop attacking Ukraine. We could have a ceasefire today if the Russian president wanted peace. It is now high time for Russia to stop attacking Ukraine and engage seriously in peace talks that the US is trying to broker. Russia must stop insisting on unserious conditions, which would, in practice, end the existence of an independent Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. We met on the topic of Ukraine only yesterday, where we thoroughly expressed our position about the war and the need to end it. Let me therefore repeat. While Ukraine has shown firm commitment to engage in a peace process, Russia is committing the largest aerial attacks since the war began. Attacks causing a steep rise in civilian casualties. This must stop. And this is where a constructive approach starts. Ukraine wants peace, Europe wants peace. not war, but peace. Mr. President, let me make a couple of additional points in this regard. Firstly, we do not accept any attempts at making inroads in the right of every country to defend itself, an inalienable right enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. What is more, a country defending itself can also develop or procure the means to do so. Such acquisitions must happen against the backdrop of the international legal framework, which among others includes resolutions adopted by this Council. What is not allowed, on the other hand, is the procurement of weapons from a country sanctioned by this very body, as seems to be the case with reported weapons transfers from DPRK to Russia. This must stop immediately, and this is, again, where a constructive approach starts. Secondly, we need peace. Ukraine needs it. Europe needs it. My country has been advocating for a just and lasting peace in Ukraine since the beginning of the war. We have been calling for the immediate return of the forcibly transferred children and the civilian prisoners for years, and we have been pushing for a ceasefire for months. All we heard in return, however, is excuses and ultimatums. And Russia continues to respond to offers of peace with drones and ballistic missiles. We want this war to end, and we will not condone any justification to continue the bloodshed. Mr. President, sitting behind this table is not just a privilege. It first and foremost comes with a great responsibility. A responsibility to maintain international peace and security. This body has been failing Ukrainians for years. It is time to step up and act towards a peace anchored in the UN Charter and its principles. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for this statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, President. Following the Security Council's meeting held just yesterday on the situation in Ukraine, I would like to briefly highlight the following key points. First, the Republic of Korea reiterates its firm position that all hostilities must cease fully and immediately. The indiscriminate use of large-scale drone and missile attacks, including Russia's largest aerial assault of the war in recent days involving hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles, only increases civilian suffering and erodes trust. Such actions, deadly and destructive, are fundamentally incompatible with any sincere efforts towards ceasefire and peace. Second, rather than merely attributing the prolongation of the war to Western military support for Ukraine, we expect the Russian Federation to demonstrate actual political will and engage constructively in negotiations. In this regard, we note Russia's recent proposal for a new round of talks in Istanbul and express our hopes for their success. However, we are particularly concerned by recent reports of Russian force buildups near the Sumy region. We hope that Russia, instead of preparing for a summer offensive, will take genuine steps toward dialogue. Third, we reiterate our concern that ongoing military cooperation between Russia and the DPRK is what is prolonging the war. Despite the repeated condemnation of the international community, Russia and North Korea continue to engage in a series of unlawful activities that are explicitly prohibited under multiple Security Council resolutions. These include the large-scale transfer of arms and related materials, as well as the training by Russian forces of North Korean troops deployed to Russia for direct support in Russia's war against Ukraine. No matter how hard the two parties attempt to obfuscate these illicit exchanges and cooperation, the Council must not turn a blind eye to such flagrant violations. Only through persistent efforts to elucidate the illegality of their actions and call for the immediate cessation can we prevent further collusion that threatens peace and security in the region and beyond. Indeed, the Council must not overlook these blatant violations. Continued efforts to expose and halt such illicit activities are essential for preventing further collusion that threatens local, regional, and global peace, as well as civilian livelihoods. In conclusion, President, it is essential that the Council remains united and resolute in supporting all efforts to bring this war to an end and forge peace. The Republic of Korea remains fully committed to working in close cooperation with the international community to help restore peace and support Ukraine's post-war reconstruction. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，
President, the Council just discussed Ukraine yesterday. I have illustrated China's position. I will refrain from repeating myself today. Since the outbreak of the war, China has been calling on the parties to the conflict to immediately agree to a ceasefire and cease fighting, launch negotiations, and restore peace. Regrettably, however, the Ukraine crisis continues to drag on, with mounting civilian casualties. This is deeply distressing and profoundly concerning. We have repeatedly stressed that another day of war brings another day of suffering and destruction, another day of instability and insecurity. With direct negotiations now underway between Russia and Ukraine, there has been an increasing number of weapons in the battlefield with greater lethality and destructive power. This will only escalate confrontation and prolong fighting. This is not conducive to achieving a ceasefire and ending the war, and runs counter to the common expectations of the international community. We urge all parties to actively forge an atmosphere conducive to peace talks by creating conditions and providing support. We also call on the parties to the conflict to work collectively towards de-escalation and a political resolution rather than persisting with military confrontation and attacks. President, the Ukraine crisis offers us one revelation: security must be mutual and equal. China advocates and upholds a global security vision that is common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable. We believe the legitimate security concerns of all countries must be taken seriously. We support all efforts for peace and stress the importance of addressing the root causes of the crisis. We look forward to an early conclusion of a just, sustained, and binding peace agreement acceptable by all the parties concerned. China stands ready to work alongside fellow members of the Group of Friends for Peace and countries in the Global South to continue to forge consensus for peace and support peace efforts, to contribute vigorously to a political settlement of the crisis. President, just now the U.S. representative once again spread misinformation, smearing and blackening China. This is utterly unacceptable. If I remember it correctly, last time the United States on the same topic used the same narrative, blamed China at the Council. That happened in January this year during the last administration of the US. In the past 4 months, the Council has deliberated on the Ukraine issue multiple times. The United States has not mentioned such a scenario, and the United States has not showed any concern or interest. Why, 4 months later, the United States once again is beating a dead horse, blaming groundlessly China? The United States' behavior at this Council once again proved that the U.S. attacks against China are not based on facts at all, and are not based on any solution at all. Rather, it is based on its own political agenda. It is utter political manipulation. I wish to reiterate 2 points. First, China has never provided any lethal weapons to any party of the conflict. We have strictly controlled dual-use items. Second, China firmly opposes to groundless acquisition and political manipulation. The United States bears a major responsibility for the outbreak of the war and the continuation of the war, but of course the United States has a responsibility to work its efforts and play its part for an early ending of the conflict. We urge the United States to concentrate on the ongoing diplomatic efforts and to stop this rather boring blaming game. I thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me to start by expressing appreciation for the exceptional leadership and professionalism that you, your PR, and your team demonstrated in steering the work of the Council during the term of Greece's presidency this month. Mr. President, Pakistan remains deeply concerned over the continuing conflict in Ukraine. Yesterday, in this very chamber, we met to discuss the devastating humanitarian and security consequences of this conflict. The use of advanced weaponry in this conflict has intensified human suffering exponentially. Mr. President, I would like to emphasize the following 3 points. First, all parties should prioritize the protection of civilians in accordance with the international humanitarian law and international human rights law. The targeting of civilians under any pretext and its characterization as collateral damage is neither acceptable nor justified. Second, the sovereign right to self-defense is enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. However, it must be exercised within the confines of international law, especially the fundamental IHL principles of distinction, proportionality, and military necessity. Third, the transfer of arms and ammunition must remain within the bounds of international legal frameworks. As a matter of principle, we remain concerned on the unregulated flow of arms into conflict zones in a manner that contributes to destabilization and imperils regional and global security. Pakistan has and continues to suffer the consequences of small arms proliferation as a result of past conflicts in our neighborhood. All parties should ensure scrupulous adherence to the end-user monitoring mechanisms to prevent the diversion, misuse, and unintended consequences of these weapons falling into wrong hands, including terrorist organizations. Mr. President, my delegation remains deeply perturbed by the fact that despite diplomatic initiatives aimed at bringing an end to this conflict, hostilities persist. We firmly believe that military means cannot resolve this conflict and reiterate that only dialogue and diplomacy can deliver sustainable peace. We encourage both sides to continue exploring the path of negotiations to bring an end to this conflict. We welcome the negotiations facilitated by the United States, Saudi Arabia, and now Turkey, leading to direct talks between Russian Federation and Ukraine. We sincerely hope that they will bear fruit. Mr. President, Pakistan's position on the Ukraine conflict has remained clear and consistent. From the outset, we have advocated for immediate de-escalation and a comprehensive ceasefire, holding of meaningful negotiations for lasting peace, addressing mutual security concerns within the framework of the UN Charter, and inclusive and constructive diplomacy involving key regional and international stakeholders to pave the way for a just and lasting peace. In closing, Mr. President, Pakistan reiterates its firm support for a peaceful resolution of this conflict and stands ready to back all efforts towards that end. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for the statement. I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Panama.
Gracias, President.
Thank you, President. I would like to echo what my colleague from Pakistan has said and congratulate Greece for their wise presidency of the Council during this month. Less than 24 hours have elapsed since the twin meeting that we had yesterday, addressing the same topic on the conflict in Ukraine. As we said yesterday, we strongly reiterate our concern about the intensification of the war that is having a direct impact on civilians. Against the current backdrop of welcome peace talks, attacks with missiles and drones are persisting. These attacks targeting civilian infrastructure and civilians. This contradiction between diplomacy and the reality on the battlefield, means that we have to speak out. Panama urges the parties to immediately cease hostilities and to protect civilians. In this complex context, it is more important than ever to reaffirm the importance of international humanitarian law and the importance of complying with the fundamental principles of proportionality, distinction, and precaution. We call for restraint and the proportional use of force. We condemn any rhetoric on the use or the threat of use of nuclear weapons. We are concerned by the transformative impact of new and emerging technologies in the dynamics of war, which particularly affect civilians. From the increasing sophistication and proliferation of drones to the increasing use of new generation missiles on the battlefield and the expansion in the uses of AI in the military domain, the very nature of how war is waged is changing. New and emerging technologies must be used with the correct intentions in mind to protect civilians and critical infrastructure as well. This arms race against an already volatile backdrop is further destabilizing international peace and security. The transfers of weapons and ammunition must be in line with international legal frameworks, including the relevant resolutions of the Security Council. President, through its own history, Panama was a victim of an aggression, and we are therefore aware of the tragic consequences of war. We reject any aggression, regardless of any geopolitical motivations. Exhaustion should not lead the international community to be silent. Given the return of the law of the strongest, we need to defend the rights laid out in the UN Charter. No state should have to renounce its sovereignty, its integrity, or its ability to live in peace. We call for negotiations to continue to lead to a lasting, fair peace in Ukraine, and this must be done on the basis of dialogue to find a peaceful solution to the conflict, respecting country sovereignty and territorial integrity in line with the Charter and international law. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Panama for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Somalia.
Thank you, Mr. President. The current developments serve as a reminder of the ongoing volatility in the region and the far-reaching consequences for civilian population and infrastructure. Recent incidents underscore the urgent need for renewed efforts to reduce tensions and prevent further escalations of the situation. Mr. President, we must acknowledge that there is no military solution to the conflict in Ukraine. My delegation welcomes all constructive engagement aimed at fostering mutual understanding and facilitating substantive negotiations. We take note of the upcoming meeting between the representative of Russia and Ukraine planned for Istanbul next week. This initiative represents a significant opportunity to advance dialogue and build momentum toward peaceful settlement. We believe that every opportunity for peace, however brief, must be seized and built upon. The only sustainable solution is to work together to strengthen diplomatic engagement and create conditions conducive to a just and lasting peace. Mr. President, we call for an immediate and comprehensive ceasefire by all parties and urge restraint to prevent further escalations of the situation. The path to peace begins with ceasefire, continues through respect for international law, and ends with justice. My delegation affirms our commitment to supporting initiatives that uphold international law, protect civilians and infrastructure, and advance diplomatic solutions. The Council's continued support will be vital in facilitating progress and encouraging all parties to remain engaged in meaningful dialogue. In conclusion, Mr. President, my delegation reiterates its call for comprehensive de-escalation, renewed diplomatic engagement, and pursuit of negotiated lasting peace in Ukraine. We stand ready to work with all Council members to support all genuine efforts toward diplomacy aimed at bringing just and lasting peace in Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Somalia for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. We've listened very carefully to the Russian delegation, including their attacks on the UK. Let me say one thing. Let us all hope that Russia engages more seriously and with more sincerity in the peace talks than we've heard here today. Russia has just blamed the UK and other European countries for somehow sabotaging peace. They're trying to complicate things and confuse us. But the reality is quite simple. Let me restate a few basic facts. Number one, Russia invaded Ukraine, twice, in fact, in recent years. Number two, Russia violated the UN Charter. Number three, Russia is, right as we speak, trying to annex Ukrainian land. Number four, Russia appears, from its public statements, to be seeking the overthrow of the government in Kyiv and to impose limits on Ukraine's independence. Number five, Russia has rejected an unconditional ceasefire. Number six, Russia continues to bomb cities across Ukraine. 900 drone and missile attacks in just 3 days last week. There is plenty more we could talk about, including Russia's use of sophisticated weaponry in urban areas, killing civilians, or its reckless seizure of the largest nuclear power plant in Europe. We could talk about the enablers of Russia's war, such as weapons flows from Iran and its military partnership with the DPRK, in violation of Council resolutions, and weaponized dual-use goods from other third parties. But in the end, we don't really need to look beyond the most essential facts about Russia's invasion to understand the situation and what needs to happen next. Ukraine, on the other hand, 1, is defending its territory, 2, is defending the principles of the UN Charter, and 3, has agreed to an unconditional ceasefire. President Zelensky has even offered direct talks with President Putin, which President Putin has rejected. So yes, the UK stands proudly with Ukraine as it seeks a just and lasting peace. Supporting Ukraine to defend itself from Russian attacks is not the cause of this war. It's a necessary response to it. The onus really is on Russia and President Putin to show they are serious about ending the war that they started. Let us hope that they do that very soon. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, President. After a lull of several months, Russia is resuming its meetings on arms deliveries, as it does every time when it is an obstacle to the cessation of hostilities. Let's recall the facts. On the 24th of February 2022, Russia chose to begin this war of aggression. Every day since then, it has made the choice to continue it and to up the ante. The strikes of the 24th and 25th of May are the most significant drone and missile strikes since the war began. 25 people died. Many calls for Russia to stop the war have been launched by states from all regions of the world. European states, who met in Kyiv on the 10th of May, called, alongside Ukraine, for an immediate, complete and unconditional ceasefire to allow for peace talks. I quote from their joint declaration. They called for a comprehensive ceasefire in the air, the sea and on the land, to last for at least 30 days to leave space for diplomacy. What Russia wants is for Ukraine to be disarmed and to not be able to exercise its right to legitimate defense in line with the UN Charter, so that Ukraine has no choice but to capitulate and to accept the annexation of its territory and other Russian demands, for it to renounce its territorial integrity and even its sovereignty. President, Russia is demanding that arms deliveries to Ukraine stop. But what's it doing in the meantime? Russia is continuing to increase its missile stocks and its production of drones. It's undermining the foundations of the international non-proliferation architecture. It is stocking up on drones and ballistic missiles from Iran. It is stocking up on ammunition and ballistic missiles from North Korea. It is doing so, flagrantly violating the resolutions of the Security Council, which it nevertheless supported at the time. On the 28th of April, Russia and North Korea admitted that North Korean soldiers have taken part in some of the Russian army's operations in Ukraine. France condemns this illegal cooperation, which has direct consequences on European security interests. Supporting Russia means being complicit in its aggression and demands in Ukraine. The International Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine was clear in its report, which was published on the 29th of May. Drone attacks on Ukrainian civilians are crimes against humanity. France urges all states to refrain from supplying military equipment to Russia, as well as dual-use goods and all components that fuel this war of aggression. France will continue to provide Ukraine with the military support that is critical for it to defend its independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity, pursuant to the United Nations Charter. Russia is attacking Ukraine in border regions from military sites located behind the Russian border. Ukraine must be able to neutralize military targets involved in operations that target them. This means Ukraine being able to exercise its right to defend itself. France will continue to call on Russia to accept an immediate, comprehensive and unconditional ceasefire. This is the first step that needs to be taken in order to commit sincerely to peace. Ukraine has taken this step for more than 3 months, and it's high time for Russia to do likewise. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, when this Council met yesterday to discuss the ongoing war in Ukraine, many members, including Guyana, called for a lasting ceasefire and for the conflict parties to prioritize dialogue and take concrete steps towards ending the war. We reiterate that call today. The civilian toll in this war continues to mount with ongoing violations of international humanitarian law. This is enabled by the diversity of weapons being used, including those with advanced technologies, and their indiscriminate use, particularly in populated areas. The recent report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry documented drone attacks that systematically struck civilians and civilian objects, including ambulances, which have special protection under international humanitarian law. Meanwhile, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine continues to document high rates of civilian casualties owing to the use of missile and loitering munitions. This Council's attention has been drawn on many occasions to the use of powerful explosive weapons in urban areas. Recent reports indicate the use of greater intensity missiles with fragmentation warheads that scatter fragments across large open areas, killing and injuring many civilians at once. In addition, the use of landmines, including anti-personnel and anti-vehicle mines, has also been reported, along with other weapons that are indiscriminate by nature and whose effects cannot be limited as required under international humanitarian law. Many of these weapons not only present an immediate threat to civilians during the conflict, but also pose a danger to lives and livelihoods long after it ends. Guyana once again calls upon the parties transferring weapons into this or any armed conflict to comply fully with international disarmament instruments and obligations, and to ensure that all transfers are conducted within the existing international legal framework, including UN Security Council resolutions, and with adequate controls in place to prevent their irregular transfers. Guyana further reminds that all parties to an armed conflict bear the primary responsibility of ensuring the protection of civilians. We demand that the parties to this conflict uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law, including by taking constant care to prevent harm to civilians and civilian objects, and to grant safe and unhindered access to humanitarian assistance for all those in need. The failure to protect civilians in an armed conflict or to ensure that conflict parties uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law undermines the very foundation of peace and security and the mandate of this Council. In closing, Mr. President, Guyana once again urges the parties to commit in good faith to a diplomatic process that will lead to a lasting ceasefire and ultimately to an end to this conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for the statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Sierra Leone is deeply concerned about the worsening impact of the conflict in Ukraine on civilians and civilian infrastructure, which continues to deteriorate at an alarming rate. We note with grave concern the increased use of long-range drones and ballistic missiles, as well as the intensification of aerial strikes in heavily populated areas. These actions continue to inflict severe harm on civilians, particularly in Ukraine, with rising numbers of civilian deaths, injuries, and displacements. We reiterate our principled position that all transfers of weapons in conflict situations must be conducted in accordance with the applicable international legal framework and relevant United Nations Security Council resolutions. Such transfers must include pre-transfer risk assessments and end-user verification mechanism to prevent the diversion of arms and ammunition. At the briefing held by this Council yesterday afternoon on the situation in Ukraine, both Under-Secretary General De Carlo and Director Dutton emphasized the importance of the parties committing to a ceasefire agreement that could bring an end to the killing and destruction. The figures referenced yesterday concerning the dead and injured represent not just statistics, but lives, hopes, and futures lost during over 3 years of continuous fighting. The humanitarian impact of this prolonged war is undeniably and underscores the urgent need for concerted efforts by the parties to the conflict, as well as by regional and international partners to immediately end hostilities and work towards a lasting peace. With approximately 45,000 civilian casualties since February 2022, even one more death or injury is one too many. According to OCHA, around 40% of Ukraine's population requires some form of humanitarian assistance, including life-saving emergency aid. Entire neighborhoods and villages have been decimated, resulting in the largest displacement of people in Europe since World War II. We also note with concern reports of civilian casualties and damage to civilian infrastructure within the territory of the Russian Federation. Mr. President, Sierra Leone is fully aware that negotiating a ceasefire and reaching a peace agreement in this conflict remains deeply challenging, given the diverging priorities and positions presented by both parties. Over the past 3 years, several efforts have unfortunately fallen short of achieving even a temporary cessation of hostilities. Nevertheless, this Council and all relevant stakeholders must continue to urge the parties to put the interests of their citizens first and work toward an immediate cessation of hostilities and a durable peace. In this regard, allow me to make 3 points. First, the evolution of diplomatic engagement from indirect to direct talks between the parties in Istanbul signals a willingness to pursue a political solution. While these talks have not yet produced a ceasefire agreement, the recent exchange of 2,000 prisoners of war, including civilian detainees, represent a significant confidence-building measure that should be strengthened and expanded. Second, the ongoing negotiations should fully take into account the legitimate concerns of both parties, including their long-term security needs. It is essential that both countries are represented at the highest political levels during these negotiations. A durable peace agreement must be underpinned by a roadmap with clear objectives and actions rooted in the principles of respect for sovereignty and territorial integrity in accordance with internationally recognized borders. Third, we emphasize the critical role of the Security Council in supporting practical steps towards lasting peace that are consistent with the principles of the United Nations Charter and guided by the decisions of the General Assembly and the Council's own resolutions. Monitoring of ceasefires and peace agreements will be essential to sustaining peace and stability in the region. In conclusion, Sierra Leone underscores the urgent need for all parties to the conflict to prioritize the protection of civilians, refrain from further escalation, and abandon any strategy aimed at achieving victory through prolonged military confrontation. We call on all parties to engage in genuine good faith diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving a peaceful and lasting resolution to the conflict. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for the statement. The representative of the United States has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wanted to briefly respond to the question by the representative of China. For the past 4 months, the United States has been using its voice and influence with both Russia and Ukraine to find a path to peace. We have been willing to use that influence, even with our friends. China's dual-use goods contribute to and sustain Russia's war effort. We invite China to also use its voice and influence with its friends to advance the path to peace and to consider restricting dual-use goods to Russia. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for the statement. The representative of China has asked for the floor to make a further statement. I give them the floor.
President, I don't want to take up more valuable time of the Council and the members. However, I felt compelled to respond to the remarks of the representative of the United States. China resolutely rejects the baseless accusation of political manipulation of the U.S. We urge the U.S. to focus on the current diplomatic efforts and stop senseless blaming game. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Greece. Dear colleagues, Russia has requested this meeting to address alleged attempts by the European countries to undermine the peace process of what it calls Ukrainian crisis. Yet, our reading of the situation is quite different. I would like to emphasize a few key points. First, let us be clear. The war that has been raging on for well more than 3 years in Ukraine is the product of Russia's invasion of the country, in violation of the most fundamental principles of the United Nations Charter and international law, the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Against this violation, Ukraine has the legitimate, inherent right to defend its people and territories, as enshrined on Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. This right includes procurement of the necessary means for self-defense as long as it fully complies with the relevant international legal framework. It is clear that should Russia decide to heed the calls of the overwhelming majority of the international community and withdraw its troops from Ukrainian territory, this war would stop immediately. Second, as UN briefers in previous Security Council meetings have stressed, transfers of weapons to Ukraine from various governments have been widely documented through open sources. On the contrary, there were only reports of transfer of weapons to Russia, at least until last month, when Russia and the DPRK admitted the extent of their military cooperation, which includes the deployment of thousands of DPRK soldiers on Russian territory. We underline that the presence of DPRK troops in the theater of war, in violation of multiple unanimously adopted Security Council resolutions, endangers international peace and security on a regional scale with potentially far-reaching consequences for global security, including its nuclear dimension. Third, while the peace initiative of the United States is already in its fourth month and Ukraine has accepted the US proposal for the 30-day unconditional ceasefire, deadly aerial attacks with record numbers of long-range missiles and drones against residential areas of Ukraine have continued unabated, with April bearing witness to the highest number of civilian casualties in recent months. It is evident that these actions are in violation of international humanitarian law and not conducive to good faith negotiations. Finally, Greece reiterates that a full, immediate, and unconditional ceasefire should be the first step towards the overarching goal, which is a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace achieved through inclusive diplomacy in line with the UN Charter and international law that upholds Ukraine's sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.